screw California, I'm going to Texas and Florida. Like,
Yeah.
how did that impact your book of business? Was that something that you didn't expect, or like, what was your take on it?
I expected it 100% because I agreed with it.
Yeah.
Like it's funny because I actually got interviewed during the pandemic on Fox News. I was at one of my clients in Chula Vista. He owns a few restaurants, and like coming from the service industry and coming from small business, and working with those people about 8 years up to that point, it hit their bottom line so bad.
Yeah.
And you feel for them, because people don't understand like the impact that some of these regulations had on businesses. And it didn't matter what industry. And the only ones that really did very well during the pandemic are, shipping companies and like trucking companies. They crushed it. I mean, they did very well because everybody's ordering everything from home, But like, think about it. Even restaurants with takeout, right, and like DoorDash, they're not getting people into their restaurant to buy other things. You're just getting your food. So you're not buying the upsell on drinks or anything.
The experience
that you may get in there. And so you feel for these people. I didn't blame them for wanting to, do things illegally or like reopen and do this and that, because you understand how highly regulated a lot of this stuff is. And like, they're paying insurance. It's not like they got a break on their mortgages, or their lease during the pandemic. They still had to pay that. So you had to figure out ways to do business, and
still had their employees to pay. And another thing, and a lot of these folks this is their life and blood, right?
Yeah.
You meet these mom and pop restaurants who are so passionate about the business that they've built over the past few decades, just to see, the government kind of come in and really make their life a lot harder. And sometimes they shut down, which is horrible to see.
Yeah. Well, and people, like I said, another thing to piggyback off that is like people don't realize the cost of doing business, right?
Yeah.
We go into a restaurant and like, yeah, it's kind of expensive, but you don't realize the cost of food went up during the pandemic. The cost of labor went up during the pandemic. Employees are taking, even it's legitimate, right? A lot of employees were taking sick days that they didn't need, right? And I understand that because you can't legally ask, and I get why they do that. You can't legally ask why someone takes a sick day. And then people, like, obviously, as we know, like the younger generations, kind of silent quitting, not showing up for work, and like I try to see both sides of the argument. I just know that like seeing the business owners struggle when they have poured all their money into that company and they have a freaking $10,000 a month lease. You have all these employee costs, you have insurance costs, you have utility costs. There's no break on that, right?
Yeah.
So I just really felt for them during that, and I wanted people to do business still, and I helped them. I wanted to see them succeed too, so I would give them leads. I would say, hey, look at this, look at that, depending on what industry they're in,
Yeah.
Try to help them get through that,
Yeah, and you don't have to mention company names, but were there any scenarios where you really did see a specific business or case that was negatively impacted, maybe the worst? And then did you also see any folks that really took advantage of that and excelled more than they would have expected to?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm thinking back on that. A lot of I do have a lot of restaurant clients that struggled, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of them shut down, or they just had to cut their labor, and people don't understand, like we were talking about a minute ago, is that like you have to make cuts somewhere, and then you don't want to see people lose their jobs or anything either, but unfortunately, if you don't have the bandwidth of customers coming through, you have to make those cuts. So mostly restaurants I saw. Obviously, bars were shut down even more than most restaurants. They can't do takeout. If you're a full service bar, what are you going to do? You still got a mortgage to pay. You can't even open for anything.
No drinks to go. Right?
No drinks to go. So they struggled a lot. The ones that I did see excel, a lot of construction companies.
Okay.
You think about it. People are sitting around. They're looking at their house during the pandemic, and that's what a lot of them told me. Like they see projects like, oh, well, they're getting a little money back from the government.
Finally get my backyard redone.
Yeah. So like I have a pool company that crushed it during the pandemic. They made a ton of money, best they've ever done. They didn't qualify for any of the tax credits for businesses because they made too much money during the pandemic.
Wow.
So you like to see that. You like to see them succeed. But you also feel for like a lot of businesses because obviously I work with bankers too, and you see a lot of BS too, because I would see companies that really needed PPP loans that would get not approved from. A lot of my restaurant clients didn't get much, or they were waiting forever. And you see some guy opening up his, S Corp with all his family doing some BS thing, to get a loan that's not legitimate,
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that. You see that. you heard about it, and it made me sad because you really know that there are businesses that needed that money.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people taking advantage of the situation and making up fake companies and doing things to get PPP loans. And obviously a lot of them gotten caught now. So
I was going to say,
F 'em,
yeah.
but like, you just feel for them, for the people who needed that money during the pandemic to actually survive and keep their employees on staff,
Yeah, and now that, to your point, now that we're 4 years later, we have started to see some of the consequences of people who were doing things a little dirty, or even politicians who weren't supposed to be taking that money and were taking it. So it's shameful, because when you're in that type of catastrophe, and it really was, right? Like no one knows what's going on. It's like, hey, the whole world shuts down for, let's call it 2 to 4 weeks. Makes sense to me. Like, we don't know what's going on, but after that, hey, maybe it's a little bit safer to shut things down because you don't know what's getting spread around. But what's the negative impact to the economy? What's the negative impact to the mom and pop owners who own these businesses? So the way I see it was, a lot of the people who were justifying all the lockdowns were saying, well, no, we need to think of safety first. And it's like, sure, but what are the negative consequences? And now that we've been 4 years later, we've really seen this thing take a massive negative impact on the world. So in my view, not a good idea. And when you see these places like Florida or even Sweden, I think those were two places that shut down for 2-3 weeks and then said, okay, nothing else is really happening here. Like, we want to keep our kids going to school, right? We want to keep our businesses going. And I didn't even think about the school aspect, but most places, even in California, kids weren't in school for 2 years. That's not good, right? Like, we want strong, capable American citizens. And when these kids are just playing on their Nintendo all day and like jerking off, like, you're not going to freaking learn anything.
No. Well, and there's a biological consequence too on top of that, because they talk about in the early years, kids at school are supposed to be getting dirty. They're supposed to be exposed to germs and bacteria because it makes their immune system stronger over time. And when you're not putting that, what happened to most of the kids when they came back to school 2 years later? They got sick, right? There was a ton of illnesses going around in the beginning when people came back because you weren't exposed to anything for 2 years.
Yeah.
They were sheltered in. And then the loss of that human dynamic, right? Of interacting with kids and learning social norms, or what we consider social norms for the most part. There's kids that lost that completely at ages where that's imperative, right? That determines how you're going to be, not necessarily for the rest of your life, but for a good portion of your young childhood. And then I always felt for I know people, it's not the biggest thing in the world, but like high school kids that miss out on prom. I felt for that because that was such a great experience for me when I was younger. And that's a huge turning point in like a teenager's life. It's a big deal, at least, for most of our history that's been around.
Yeah.
It's like a coming of age event.
Transitioning to adulthood.
Yeah. And it's a part where, especially if you're a young man, you're asking a girl to go to the prom with you. That's a big deal, and then your parents are happy you're taking pictures. It's a family bonding thing, whether you think so or not. When I look back on it, I'm like, my parents took pictures with us. It was like a big moment.
Yeah.
And that's the least of anybody's worries around the world, but still, it's like, it is for Americans at least. That's a big part of our growing up.
Yeah.
So I felt more for the kids, that they miss out on a lot of stuff that shapes your environment and shapes the way you look at the world.
Yeah.